Well, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining our November Lunch and Learn 2025. We have such a treat for you today. We have a visiting scholar conducting our Lunch and Learn today, Charles Koenig, Dr. Charles Koenig. Charles got his undergraduate in anthropology at the University of Colorado at Boulder, his master's at the Texas State University in San Marcos, and his PhD at the University of Wyoming in Laramie. And his particular interests are in earth oven technology, rock art, and his master's thesis and doctoral dissertation. The master's thesis was Burned Rock Middens, Settlement Patterns, and Bias in the Lower Pecos Canyonlands of Texas. And then his PhD, completed in 2023, was the record of early Holocene earth oven cooking in Texas and Wyoming and implications for subsistence intensification, technological change, and return rates. So today we are going to hear from him all about the people who painted the art that Shumla studies and preserves, and their lifeways and things that really inform a lot of the research that Shumla does. And so we're so happy to have Charles with us today. And Charles, you can take it away.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Jessica, and thank you to Jessica and Emil and Carrie and the rest of the Shumla staff for having me be a part of this lunch and learn. Very happy to be here. So, as Jessica said, my name is Charles Koenig, and I am currently an assistant professor at the University of Texas at Austin in the Department of Anthropology. And what I'm going to be talking about today is work that I've been a part of for about a decade at this point. And so the title of my talk that is the early Holocene record of Indigenous lifeways at Eagle Cave, but really I'm kind of presenting on behalf of myself and so many other colleagues and collaborators have been working on this project over the last decade plus, several of which are in the audience today. Um, so to get things started, as Jessica said, Shumla doesn't you never really get to leave Shumla in that sense. So I first came to Lower Pecos Canyonlands in 2008. I was a student at the Shumla Rock Art Field School. And this is where I learned about the pictographs and also about other aspects of the material culture. And this is where I fell in love with the archaeology in Southwest Texas, and I've continued to study this for my career. So today, what I'm going to be talking about is a little bit of background on Lower Pecos Canyonlands and specifically Eagle Cave, um, and the archaeological work that's happened there. Then I'm going to go into kind of like this early Holocene record, like what does it mean? Uh, what can we learn about how Native peoples were living in Lower Pecos between about 10,000 and 5,000 years ago? And then kind of what are the implications for earth oven cooking when it comes to these early Holocene lifeways? And many of you have sat in numerous lunch and learn talks, so you're familiar with where the Lower Pecos is, and you've heard some incredible speakers talk about the different types of pictographs and the meanings and cosmology and other things like that. And so, what I'm going to be talking about is kind of the other side of this. The region, in addition to the pictographs, is really well known for the perishable artifacts, but there's a lot of other archaeological remains that we can learn a great deal from. And so, to frame this, I think it's really important that everyone just remembers that this region and arguably all of North America has been home to at least 500 generations of indigenous peoples. And so they've left an incredible mark on the landscape and the archaeology and are still there today. And so when we look at the Lower Pecos specifically, and we're talking about how did they make a living, what foods do they eat, there's lots of different resources on the landscape today, as there would have been in the past, that you can just go up to and eat raw, essentially. So things like fruits and nuts, like walnuts and mesquite pods or prickly pear fruit. Obviously, if you burn off the small spines and pecans, these are foods that anyone, our human digestive system can handle these. You can go eat them raw. But there's a lot of other foods that we know Native peoples ate throughout the Lower Pecos and other areas of North America, including agave lechuguilla, sotols, different types of yuccas, onion, and mature prickly pear pads, where these specific types of foods you can't necessarily go eat raw. So you have to do something to cook these plants so that we can digest them in our bodies. And so Native peoples millennia ago, and arguably all the way back into the Eastern Hemisphere, learned that you could use specific types of technology, earth ovens in this case, to render a lot of those different plants edible. And so earth ovens is not something that are left to the archaeological distant past. These are still a cooking technology that native peoples use today all around the world. Our neighbors, the Mescalero Apache, still build every summer, will build a large earth oven to bake agave as part of their girls' puberty ceremonies. You can go to a lot of different cultures and see this technology in play. And so this is what we're going to be talking about today, is we're going to be framing the record, the archaeological record in the Lower Pecos around this specific type of technology. And so what does this look like from a like technological standpoint? So if anyone has built a barbacoa pit or did any other like cooked a sheep or a goat or potentially a whole cow underground, you've probably done this same process. So, or a similar process, I should say. So how it starts, let me see if I can get my well, so you build a pit in the ground, and into that pit, you put a bunch of wood, and on top of the wood, you put a bunch of rock. And so this is going to become the earth oven eventually, and you light it on fire. And so what's going to happen is as that wood burns, those rocks start to absorb all that thermal energy generated by the fire, and the rocks slowly settle into the bottom of the pit, and this becomes your oven heating element. So different than your gas or electric heating element at home when you can just turn it to 450 degrees or 350 or whatever it is. An earth oven works by you get these rocks really, really hot. We're talking 500 to 1,000 degrees Celsius. And basically, those rocks start really, really hot. And over time, they're going to slowly release that thermal energy. And that's going to be what helps to cook it. So you have this oven heating element that starts really hot. On top of that, you put a layer of packing material. These are agave lechuguilla leaves. And so that packing material is going to be a barrier between your really, really hot rocks and the food you're going to put on next. And it's also going to provide moisture. And I'll talk about that in just a second. So packing material, and then goes on top of that goes the food. These are trimmed agave lechuguilla hearts. So this is one of the plant foods that native peoples living in the Lower Pecos would have eaten for the last 10,000 years. Over the food goes another layer of packing material. These, in this example, we put another bunch of lechuguilla leaves over it and then topped everything with grass. And then finally, you cover it all with dirt, the sediment cap. And so this is what it looks like. This is why it's called an earth oven, right? It's cooking underground, but it doesn't look very exciting when it's doing its thing. But this is a wonderful artistic rendition of like what's happening underneath. And so basically you have these really, really hot rocks that are heating up all this green plant material and the food to about the boiling point of water. Now, because the heat can't escape, and also the moisture can't escape and oxygen can't get in, the heat that's held in those rocks basically just steams all that green plant material at around 100 degrees Celsius. You can think of an earth oven as a pre-industrial crock pot. It's going to cook all this food at a fairly low temperature for a really long period of time, and that's what's going to help to break all these complex carbohydrates and things that our bodies can't digest, turn it into things that we can break down, sugars and other types of carbohydrates. So for lechuguilla, you come back about 2 days later, so 36 to 48 hours later, and you open up that oven. And so you peel back that upper layer of dirt that's capping the oven. You peel back that upper layer of pack material, and you notice how everything is gone from like a green or cream color of the grass to now everything's like orange. And so that's the carbohydrates and stuff in all these plants converting to more sugars that we can digest. And there's a lechuguilla after it's been cooked. And this is what a cooked lechuguilla heart looks like. It has the consistency of like somewhat of a baked sweet potato, and you can smell the sugars in it. Agave plants have a lot of sugars after they've been cooked, which is why, in addition to being able to eat this material, there's also a high probability that folks in the distant past were using this to produce some sort of lightly alcoholic fermented drink out of the baked agave. I don't have time to go on that today, but it's not just food, it's drink and also all the fiber and stuff that comes out of this. So this is what it looks like archaeologically after an earth oven is done. You have all this plant material scattered around these oven pits. You got burned rock down the center, but over time and we're talking geologic time here, archaeological time in the span of centuries to millennia, what's going to happen is all that stuff is going to rot away. All the leaves are going to be gone. In some cases, the geology is the rock, the dirt's all going to be washed away, and you're going to be left with these beds of fire-cracked rock, or HARs, as archaeologists like to call them. And each one of these is actually representing that earth oven heating element. This is what heated up the food. This is what cooked food. Whatever that food was, this is what was doing it. And so we see these all over, not just Lower Pecos, but all over the Western Hemisphere, where you have these hearth features that were very likely, not all of them, but many of them may have been these heating elements of earth ovens. So one of the interesting things about this, and important to remember, especially for the Lower Pecos, is that every single earth oven you build, the rocks are going to, so as they get heated up, those rocks are going to start to break apart and fracture because of thermal stresses. And so to put my Dr. Phil Daring at the Shumla Experimental Earth Oven location at the Shumla campus, as you do more and more ovens, all that rock and stuff is there's going to be rock that fractures and pile ups and fractures, and you build another oven, and eventually all that stuff turns into a ring around this central oven pit. And that ring, that feature, collectively we call earth oven facilities or burned rock middens. And these are one of the most common archaeological features in the Lower Pecos. These represent dozens to thousands of earth ovens built at this single spot on the landscape. And you have a fairly diagnostic set of arrangement of these features, where you have the inner and you have discard areas that are kind of surrounding the central pit. You have the oven heating element still within that pit, but lots and lots and lots of burned rock. And these features are everywhere. So this is from my thesis research that's over 10 years old at this point. But burned rock middens in these earth oven facilities are the most common archaeological feature in the Lower Pecos. These things are everywhere you go. And these are just showing the locations that archaeologists have recorded and found these sites. There's thousands and thousands of more that we haven't recorded or found yet. And so these features are everywhere. And we also, and you're going to hear a little bit about this, but we know that in the Lower Pecos, just Lower Pecos and in Edwards Plateau and out to the Big Bend of Texas, we have over a 10,000 year record of indigenous earth oven cooking just in our part of North America. And to put this in another landscape perspective, so this map is showing just the area of the Chihuahuan Desert in Texas. The Chihuahuan Desert is one of the largest biotic provinces in all of North America, and Texas is home to just a small sliver of it, relatively speaking. But earth ovens happen all throughout the Chihuahuan Desert. And to take a page out of our colleague Miles Miller's playbook. So Miles Miller, he's an archaeologist who works in El Paso. He's a big thinker. He likes to put earth ovens and pueblos and human effort into the bigger context. So we have 95,000 square kilometers of Chihuahuan Desert in Texas. If we take two areas of the Chihuahuan Desert that are well surveyed, meaning archaeologists have gone out to these locations and recorded where these burn rock middens and earth oven facilities are, we range from 2 of these features per square kilometer in Lower Pecos up to 21 of these features per square kilometer out by El Paso. And so if we multiply that into the total area, we're looking at between 200,000 to 2 million earth oven facilities just in our small sliver of Texas. Now, if we assume that each one of those facilities was used at least 100 times, that puts us at somewhere between 20 and 200 million ovens built in the Chihuahuan Desert. This is an incredible archaeological signature that reflects a really important aspect of the archaeology and indigenous lifeways. And so I would posit that understanding the roles of earth ovens, both economic and cultural, is paramount for studying indigenous histories in the Chihuahuan Desert. We can't learn about how Native peoples lived in the past without also looking at earth ovens and how these things fit into these broader patterns. And so to do that, today I'm going to talk about Eagle Cave. Eagle Cave is one of the largest rock shelters in the Lower Pecos Canyonlands. If you've visited Langtree and you've been fortunate to go on a tour of Eagle Nest Canyon, this is where Eagle Cave is. It's just downstream from Bonfire Shelter, and the Rio Grande is right out here. And so Eagle Cave, obviously it's a large rock shelter that we're going to talk about. It also has a fairly substantial Pecos River style panel that's been recorded multiple times in the past, originally by Gootsite and Cartson, A.T. Jackson, Forrest Kirkland, and then this is the image on the left is from Schumla's documentation of the site. So it has a Pegasus style panel, but because of its overall size and how much stuff is in there, it's also the scene of a lot of excavations. And so archaeologists went to Eagle Cave beginning in the 1930s with E.B. Sales and J. Charles Kelly, followed by the Whitty Museum out of San Antonio, who dug a really deep trench through the middle of the site, and then followed up by the University of Texas at Austin in 1963, who expanded that original Whitty Trench and did some more excavations. Now, these folks were focused on stuff. They were focused on projectile points and sandals and atlatl fragments and things like that. They weren't necessarily focused on the burned rock. In fact, it wasn't something that, besides saying there's burned rock here, it wasn't a focus of any type of analysis. So I was a part of the Texas State University team. They returned to Eagle Cave between 2014 and 27 to re-excavate some of these areas that have been previously disturbed and do modern sampling. What else can we learn about Eagle Cave, and how do these remains reflect the peoples that lived here in the past? And so this is what it looked like in 2014 when we started. So in a dry rock shelter, the sediments and all the dirt and artifacts and stuff are really loose and in this kind of silty, unconsolidated fill. And so after the University of Texas at Austin had excavated, the trench started to slump. So it went from something that was about 5 to 10 feet wide in 1963. As that trench slumped, it eventually the top of the trench was about 35 feet wide. And so what we did is we started to remove some of that disturbed fill and start to expose the stratigraphy on the south side of the main trench. And so this is 2015. And you can see all the different layers and changes in the color of sediment as we got down deeper. These are just photographs of our different crew members that we had on site helping to actually, or not helping to do the excavations and things like that. All the way up to this is the last photograph we took of the trench, and this is right before we started to backfill. So the black cloth, that's geotextile. So that's what we put down before we started backfill. In the far back of the photograph, you can see a big pile of sand, and you can see carts on the left. We ultimately filled this entire trench and stabilized the site with sand, which would be, it's an incredible story and worthy of its own talk later on. But ultimately, what we found is we realized that Eagle Cave preserves a 13,000-year record of indigenous lifeways. So all the way from we had deposits as young as about 400 or 500 years ago, all the way back to just over 13,000. And so we have a Clovis Age mammoth. So you go into Eagleness Canyon or you walk you're in the Lower Pecos today. It's hard to imagine that 13,000 years ago there were Columbian mammoths walking around the Rio Grande and the Pecos and the Devil's River. And we found bits and pieces as Charles Frederick had called, an exploded mammoth that were in Eagle Cave. And we have we have flakes around it. We have this weird rock cluster. So it looks like in the Pleistocene, folks were visiting Eagle Cave and they butchered or did something with bits of a mammoth. We also have a Folsom Age bison. So this is about 12,600 years ago. And so we suspect maybe that this is related to Bonfire Shelter and Bone Bed 2. But we have lots of rib fragments, lots of stone tools, lots of intensive processing where folks brought portions of at least one bison into Eagle Cave, butchered it, made stone tools, built a fire, and things like that. So a Pleistocene evidence, but one of the most important things, especially for my own research and this talk today, is we exposed a 10,000-year record of earth oven cooking just in Eagle Cave. And this is what our colleague Alston Toms calls a carbohydrate revolution, where you go from the Pleistocene age sediments that are down here at the bottom that are all very light in color. This is mostly limestone that's coming off the interior of the rock shelter. When you hit the Holocene, right there, that is essentially the start of the Holocene. That's the end of the Pleistocene, start of Holocene, and boom, we have burned rock, we have sotol, we have lechugia, we have all kinds of other nuts and fruits and seeds where people substantially change their life way. And so we're able to see this in the earth ovens, where earth ovens were not down here, and then boom, they start right here, and then they continue on through the Holocene for the duration that Native peoples lived in the Lower Pecos. And so for this talk, I'm just going to be talking about the earliest portion of the Holocene, so roughly 10,500 to 5,500 years ago. And this is a close-up on that portion of the stratigraphy. You don't necessarily need to remember all the, so on the left, we have the stratum or the strat or the layer, the number of the layer that we had. So 385, 524 is this big red one, 525 is the one with other burned rocks, 526, and then 594. You don't need to remember those numbers. More so important is to think about it that we have a series of stratified or layered burned rock middens or earth oven facilities. So the earliest one is about 10,500 years ago, and then there's kind of not a burned rock midden facility. And then we have another one, EOF3, that's about 7,500 years ago. And then we don't have a burned rock midden, and then we have another burned rock midden about 6,500 to 5,700 years ago. So things are changing, right? It's not just a single stratigraphic sequence showing the exact same thing. Now, seeing early Holocene earth ovens is not necessarily unique to Eagle Cave. We have a really good record of these types of features in Texas, from the GLD site out in the Big Bend to Crying Woman Ranch and Richard Bean and Wilson Leonard in the Hill Country and around San Antonio north of Austin. So this technology is in use not just in Lower Pecos, but it's all across Texas by the time this 10,000 to 9,000 year time frame comes into play. But the preservation and stratigraphy of Eagle Cave presents a unique opportunity to evaluate these changes in earth oven use and broader indigenous lifeways during the early Holocene that is not possible from a lot of those other sites because Eagle Cave is a dry rock shelter. Those other sites are just open air terrace locations where a lot of stuff, charcoal, animal bone, any uncarbonized plant remains, that's totally gone because over time all that stuff kind of rots away and is and disappears and we can't see it archaeologically. So let's zoom in on this early Holocene component in Eagle Cave. This is just a colorized stratigraphic annotation. So we're looking at this entire portion down here towards the bottom of the profile. The profile being that cross section through the site, all these different strata. And so of course there's a lot of different theories and methods that archaeologists use to evaluate why do people's diets change? Why do they do different types of things? How do their lifeways change? There's a lot of different ways to ask that question. And so one of the ways that we've been doing it is through this idea of intensification. I'm going to explain what this is. This is a fairly common, especially in hunting, gathering, or foraging archaeology, common way to look at changes in lifestyle or changes in diet. So intensification, to put very simple, is the process where increasing populations, meaning more people on the landscape, cause people to work harder and longer to gather food. In other words, if there's 30 of us on this call, think about how much effort we would have to go into today to go out into non-urbanized settings and hunt and gather food. Well, so that's going to take us a lot of work. It would take 5 people a lot less work. You could hunt one deer. Or if we had more people, if we had 100 people on this call, it's going to take us even longer and more energy to gather food for all of us to cook. So that's kind of the idea behind intensification, working harder and longer to gather food. And so archaeologists look at this where as you work harder, you bring in different types of food. So it's really easy, quote unquote, to go kill one bison or kill multiple deer. But it gets harder if you need to feed everyone with rabbits. You need to kill a bunch of rabbits to be able to feed all of us, fish, and plants. So for archaeologists, when we start to see things like earth ovens and plant processing show up in the archaeological record, we interpret that as being there's lots of people that are struggling to get enough food for people to eat. And we put that into this idea of resource return rates. This is basically a calorie return rate, so kilocalories per hour. It's basically the bang for your buck of how much energy, how much food do you get for how much time you spend hunting it or going after it. And so based on work of Phil Daring, Lechuguilla has a return rate that's fairly low, 700 to 830 kilocalories per hour. So put in perspective, a single Big Mac meal, I think, is almost 2,000 calories at McDonald's. Doing some more work recently, Lechuguilla has a return rate of 300 to 3,000 kilocalories per year. But regardless, you're still having to put a lot of energy into cooking these plants just to get whatever calories and food you're able to get out of building an oven. So this idea of intensification is very, very much archaeological. But we look at how earth ovens are used among contemporary indigenous communities, it kind of presents a different perspective. Rather than being people are using earth ovens to get extra calories to feed everyone in the landscape, they're really rooted in this idea of food for social events, that you're using earth ovens to host feasts and host parties or religious holidays or ceremonial events. And there's a relationship, especially in arid landscapes of the American Southwest and Northwest Mexico, where cooking and agave and deer are almost exclusively done in earth ovens. So it's not necessarily food because you have a lot of people in the landscape. It's food because you're bringing people together and hosting these different types of activities. You can also ferment these, so social lubricant as far as like baked agave. But importantly, earth ovens and agave are integrally woven into indigenous cultures. And so for Eagle Cave, we can take these two kind of ideas and put that into different hypotheses. So the first hypothesis is that the record of earth oven cooking in Eagle Cave should correlate with regional models of population, where people cook desert succulents to meet the energetic demands of a growing population. That classic intensification due to increasing population working harder and longer. Or the record of earth oven cooking reflects repeated occupations as part of social aggregations, feasting, and ceremonies. Now, neither of these two hypotheses is mutually exclusive, and they're really at opposite ends of the spectrum. And we can't necessarily see whether either one or both may have been coming into play at different points in time, but it's important that we at least consider these alternative explanations for why people are spending so much energy to cook plants in Eagle and use earth ovens and cook plants in Eagle Cave. So to provide a little bit more environmental background, what's happening in early Holocene? What is climate doing? What challenges are folks having to cope with as they're using Eagle Cave? So we can use Hall's Cave, which is a sinkhole near Kerrville in central Texas, so northwest of San Antonio, for those of you who are not familiar with Texas geography. And Hall's Cave is one of the best studied paleoclimate records that we have in Texas. And to this, I've added a Arenosa shelter paleohydrology chronology, basically saying where is it cool and where is there lots of rainfall, where is it get more arid, and also a Devil's Mouth pollen sequence. Those are both from sites in the Lower Pecos. And I'm going to just put on a big rectangle the time period we're looking at here. There's a lot of like fine scale resolution or fine scale variation in this component of the early Holocene, which I'll talk about in a second. But by and large, from 10,000 to 5,000 years ago, the climate is arid after the Pleistocene, but you have shorter term climate variation where you have like changes in the amount of moisture, the amount of rainfall that's happening. And I'll show another slide here. So this is what we've done to Eagle Cave so far. This is the work of Charles Frederick and looking at the geoarchaeological, so the sediment signature that we have in Eagle Cave. So I'm going to start over here on the left. So this is just showing you how much of these deposits are different particle size: clay, silt, sand, gravel. And unsurprisingly, our three major burned rock midden strata have a lot of larger gravel. So that's more burned rocks, more large gravels happening. But we have some really interesting things climatically that happen. So we look at the mineralogy in XRD, that's looking at the mineral composition of the fine grained matrix. We have a peak of what we've identified as Rio Grande alluvium. So Eagle Cave and Eagle Nest Canyon is a tributary to the Rio Grande, but as far as we know, the Rio Grande has never back flooded up into Eagle Cave, but we have a peak in Rio Grande derived sediments between about 7,400 and 6,000 years ago. And so what we think this might represent is this is a time of really arid environment across North America. So this has often been called the altithermal or the Holocene climatic maximum. Basically, you have all these sandy silt deposits down the Rio Grande, and if you don't have a lot of rain and moisture and all the grasses and vegetation are gone, when you do have wind, that wind whips up all that fine grained alluvial stuff, river transported sediments, and it blows it up canyon, and then it ends up in Eagle Cave. So we think that's showing us that it's really dry in the immediate local area around Eagle Cave. I'm going to skip carbon and nitrogen for right now. When we look at the bulk carbon stable isotope, different types of plants have different carbon pathways, and brushy plants and trees and stuff have in this value, a lower carbon isotope signature. And as you get to things like grasses, so C4 grasses, or things like agave lechugia, which are CAM arid adapted species, that's going to be the more positive values on the stable carbon isotope. So what this shows us is it goes from really brushy and water reliant species in the Pleistocene to getting more reliant on warmer and drier adapted species into the mid Holocene, showing us it's probably getting increasingly arid. Now, the stable nitrogen isotopes are really, really weird. If any of you are familiar with this at all, the lower values of this nitrogen is probably so less than 10 is what we would expect for general plant and flora and fauna nitrogen signatures in arid landscapes. We have this massive plateau. This plateau has been giving us a lot of interpretive challenges. In doing some background research, the only values that are even similar to this, meaning there's an incredible amount of nitrogen that's happening. There's a lot of nitrogen in this dirt. The only values that are anywhere near this in contemporary sampling is associated with bacterial processing during human wastewater treatment. In other words, when those bacteria get involved with breaking down human waste in our wastewater treatment plants, this is when we see these elevated signatures. So this could be reflecting some sort of human use and fecal matter or urine or something like that. But another possibility is there's been some work in the Mojave Desert where if you have really, really hot sediment that's really, really dry, and then you get a flash flood or a really intensive rainstorm that happens, those bacteria that are naturally living in these arid soils will also do a similar denitrification process. And so they're producing different types of compounds. And so it's possible that these high nitrogen values are from a bacterial denitrification process during this really arid and dry period of the Holocene where you have really, really hot dirt inside Eagle. You can think of it just baking in this massive oven in the not an earth oven, but just the geologic oven. And then you get an intensive rainfall event, and that might cause some sort of bacterial interaction where they're suddenly processing and creating different molecules of nitrogen. But it looks like, regardless of what that process is, Eagle Cave reflects that really kind of dry portion of the early to mid Holocene. So to summarize the paleoclimate, early Holocene was arid, dry, but punctuated by intense rainfall events and possible short mesic wetter intervals. So we just don't have the resolution to look at. So that's kind of the what's happening. It's really dry, but maybe some periods of good stuff. So my colleague Ken Lawrence and his colleague Josh Keene have been working on some probability, so SPD. So some probability distributions in archaeology are you're taking radiocarbon dates. So radiocarbon dates are one of the ways, the primary way that archaeologists understand how old something is. And so to get a radiocarbon date, you can do it on anything that was living in the past. And through measuring how much the ratio of um, uh, radioactive carbon isotopes to non-radioactive carbon isotopes, you can kind of count backwards how old something is. And so for some probability distribution, every time you see a peak on this graph, that basically means that there's more radiocarbon dates that archaeologists have collected down the Rio Grande Valley from the Lower Pecos almost to the almost to the Gulf, that there's more radiocarbon dates that were collected between 10,200 and 9,800 years ago than there were from 9,800 years ago to 8,000 years ago. So basically, these peaks are showing you periods of lots of radiocarbon dates that we infer are being lots of people in the landscape generating trash and other detritus. And these troughs on this are showing you periods where there's not a lot of people in the landscape, where there's fewer radiocarbon dates. So this is our way to look at, well, how many people are in Lower Pecos during these time periods? So we can overlay our different Eagle Cave strata, and we can say, okay, in our earliest period of earth oven construction, hey, we have a kind of a peak in that SPD. We have a peak in population. Perhaps that is showing us that indeed there are more people in the landscape, giving us evidence for that, population-driven intensification. The same thing with our middle burned rock midden, that there's more people in the landscape. Maybe that's causing them to use more earth ovens. Our more recent burned rock midden is a little bit different. It actually occurs at one of these troughs in population. So that's a weird causation or correlation, however you want to look at that. But to put on some other kind of more general regional patterns that we see, our earth ovens in Eagle Cave that we studied so far go just up to when we have the establishment of red linear style pictographs in the Lower Pecos. So this is from Jared Roberts' master's thesis published a couple years ago. So those early dates start about 5,500 and go to 4,500 years ago. And of course, Pecos River style, which starts almost 6,000 years ago and goes to about 1,200. So our burned rock middens are going almost up to the start of these different types of pictographic rock art. We do have dates on Eagle Cave, but they actually fall kind of in the middle of the range, the known range of Pecos River style panels. But I'm going to circle back around to this idea. But basically, we have changes in population that may or may not be corresponding with the increase in the amount of ovens that are being built in Eagle Cave. So now we can turn to some of the other material remains that we've been looking at. Our colleagues, Char Farfadet, Leslie Bush, and Kevin Henselka have been doing a lot of work looking at the macrobotanicals, so the plant remains that have been recovered from different contexts. So far, they haven't been able to do a ton of analysis on this, but they've looked at 5 stratified samples that range from late Pleistocene through the early Holocene. The oldest sample, so Strat 586, this is associated with the Pleistocene bison butchery event right here. So that's a larger sample from a hearth feature. That's 5 liters. All of these other 4 were 1 liter sample. It also doesn't include any of the radiocarbon IDs. But I want to draw your attention to, and the colors that you see on this table match with the colors on this image right here. But a few things I want to point out. Number one, there's this idea in Texas that mesquite is something that only spread out of Mexico or out of the South Texas plains relatively late in time. We have mesquite that shows up in cultural context, beginning in the Pleistocene and last all the way through every sample we've looked at so far. And Eagle has mesquite seeds or mesquite endocarp, showing that native peoples have been eating and processing and using mesquite for over 12,000 years. Lots and lots of different nuts and fruits. So walnut shows up fairly commonly, persimmon seeds, hackberry seeds, and other condalia seeds. So small little bitty fruits. Interestingly, notice how none of these require processing in earth ovens yet. So I'm kind of building up there. So we have this category of starchy seeds, greens, and grasses. So Chenopodium or goosefoot. We have an explosion of the use of Chenopodium and goosefoot beginning especially by 6,500 years ago, but Chenopodium shows up around 7,500 years ago in our middle burned rock midden. This shows that they're eating all kinds of grasses and other starchy seeds off the landscape. It's clearly not just focused on earth ovens at any point in time. Cacti, especially prickly pear pads. Prickly pear pads show up in high abundances all through the entire sample. And then finally, we get to our agave, yucca, and sotol, which are earth oven deposits. And part of this is the minimum amount of sampling that's been done. But notice there's not tons and tons of agave leaves showing up in any of these. We're not sure why that is. They're very clearly going to be cooking at it, but agave leaves are not nearly as common as things like cactus seeds and Chenopodium seeds. There's a size bias happening there as well. But the important part of this is there's lots of other foods being processed that don't necessarily require earth oven cooking to render them edible. Eagle, one of the things that made Eagle Cave famous archaeologically, especially in the 30s and the 60s, was the fact that this is of all the rock shelter sites in the Lower Pecos Canyonlands, Eagle has the largest single site assemblage of painted pebbles. And during our work, we also recovered painted pebbles. But these ones that I'm showing you on the screen now are all coming out of that middle burned rock midden zone. So in Eagle, this is a really unique behavioral expression where during the early Holocene, you have earth ovens there's going to be some relationship between all of these fine line geometric painted pebbles that are being produced and earth oven cooking that's happening. And then they don't occur in other deposits until you get to the later Holocene. On this image, I'm not going to have time to talk about this today. Up here, this is where the next kind of major zone of painted pebble production and this massive, the largest earth oven facility in Eagle Cave over the last 10,000 years is in the late Holocene with painted pebbles. So we talked about macrobotanical remains, we talked about painted pebbles, and now we're going to really quickly go through some other material indicators. So we looked at the burned rock. So we did a process called rock sort where we counted and weighed all the FCR by size classes. The idea here is that if you have higher FCR density, you're generally going to have more earth ovens. That's kind of fairly straightforward. But if you have smaller FCR, meaning those folks are reusing those FCR until they're completely exhausted, that's a different behavior than if you're discarding larger burned rock. So smaller FCR, more reuse. Reuse. There's something behaviorally going on there. We looked at a large sample of faunal remains, and with this question, we were mainly focused on how does the proportion of small game to large game change. There's a lot of different levels you can do with faunal analysis. For this one, we're really focused on how does large game to small game change? Because if folks are under regional population stress, meaning it's really dry and there's too many people and there's not enough food to go around, we expect them to be hunting things like rabbits and rodents and things like that, not necessarily hunting things like deer and pronghorn and bison, because those have been hunted by other folks. But if there's not a lot of regional population stress, we might expect there would be more large game. There's more deer and pronghorn and bison available for folks to go hunt and then bring back to eagle. We also looked at the debitage. And so this is for hunter-gatherer archaeologists looking at the debitage. So the little bits and flakes and chips that are left from producing stone tools, hunter-gatherer archaeologists will use the nature of those deposits to argue for um, uh, quick people moving quickly around the landscape or people sitting in one place and using local resources. And so for Eagle Cave, how that would look is we're looking at the proportion of igneous and chert with cortex. So in the Rio Grande, just downstream from Eagle Cave, are primary nodules, primary rocks where you can get igneous rocks and you can get large pieces of chert that still have all the cortex. And so the idea is if people are sitting in Eagle Cave for a really, really long time, you're going to see that reflected in the archaeological record. Lots of igneous and lots of big primary flakes with cortex. But if you don't see that, that means people are maybe moving around the landscape faster. So highly mobile, few igneous, few chert flakes with cortex, less mobile, more igneous, more chert flakes with cortex. So let's line all these things up and talk about how these things pattern out through the stratigraphy. So FCR density. Unsurprisingly, the FCR density is highest at our two largest burned rock middens. And we could see that going into it like, oh yeah, of course, the density is going to be higher than in these two than they would be at anywhere else. But surprisingly is that the FCR density of our smallest size class of rock, that less than 7.5 centimeters, was substantially higher at our most recent burn rock midden, meaning that those rocks are being completely used to exhaustion before they're discarded, which is a pattern we have yet to see at any of the other burned rock middens, earth oven facilities that we've sampled in Eagle. Moving on. So this is looking at all the small mammal bones out of that faunal assemblage. Unsurprisingly, small mammals represent the vast majority of all bones recovered. Small mammals, especially cottontail rabbits, cottontail jackrabbit, fox, skunk, rodents, things like that. In our earliest portion of the Holocene, our first burned rock midden and this kind of S526 was going to be in between. Almost 100% of those assemblages in those strata were derived from small mammals. So small mammals were always important for people living on this landscape. We look at non-mammals, so this is going to be things like turtles and fish. There is actually a substantial increase in the non-mammal associated with that middle burn rock midden where we have the painted pebbles coming out. And we look at the artiodactyl index, another surprising trend was that there were more deer pronghorn sized bones associated with the most recent burned rock midden than there were in any of the other ones, meaning for whatever reason, there's more deer and pronghorn bones represented in that upper burned rock midden deposit. And then finally, for our debitage and stuff, there was actually no change in those debitage assemblages, suggesting that people are still, regardless of whatever changes are happening, people are moving into and out of Eagle Cave fairly quickly. They're not spending weeks and weeks sitting at that site. So to bring this all together, the most important thing about Eagle is that all these changes I've just talked about are showing us variation in early Holocene lifeways and earth oven use. It's not just a monolith where folks are doing the same thing for 5,000 years and there's not changes. There's a lot of changes and we're just starting to see some of these changes and how they pattern out. So as far as climate goes, we think, just like everyone else has said in the past, looking at paleoclimate, the climate's arid but variable, meaning there's probably periods where there's some sort of increase in available moisture. Especially, we're very curious to know in Arenosa, which is at the mouth of the confluence of the Pecos and Rio Grande, and then Devil's Mouth, which is at the confluence of the Devil's River and the Rio Grande. We have this thing that's called an ozona erosional or ozono-erosional brief mesic period. We don't know what this reflects. We know it's some sort of substantial flooding event that's scouring out, but we don't know if this is associated with a very short-term period of intensive rainfall, or potentially this is a period of more mesic, more rainfall, and then some sort of catastrophic thing happens. The Rio Grande some probability distribution suggests oven use does correspond with population. Also, potentially, these two peaks right here in the early and in the middle could be signaling also wetter periods when it's actually a better time to be a hunter-gatherer and there's more things on the landscape, more deer, more grasses, more prickly pear, and that's also why you're building earth ovens, just because there's more people, even though it's a really good environment. We see a variety of plant usage through time. It's not just earth ovens, they're eating all kinds of other things. A unique assemblage of painted pebbles associated with that middle burned rock midden period. And again, just to reiterate, this variation between strata reflects differences in lifeways and earth oven use. It's not just one variable that's showing us is changes. It's not just earth ovens, population, climate. It's all these things are varying, not necessarily independently, but we can model them independently. And so we go back to our intensification hypotheses, population or parties. I think it's really important to emphasize that Eagle Cave is unique from other earth oven sites in the Lower Pecos and arguably across Texas, where you have indigenous use spanning 13,000 years, going all the way back to that Clovis Age mammoth. It's a persistent place with a life history. People knew about it. People would talk about it. This place had a name. We see higher numbers of deer and pronghorn bones associated with some earth oven deposits, but not all, suggesting that there's some sort of, whether it's behavioral and like butchery patterns and transport patterns, or what foods are being cooked at the site versus someplace else we don't know about. Something is changing why there's more bones ending up in Eagle Cave at that time period. We have clear evidence of ritual and ceremonial use of space from painted pebbles to the later parietal, the Pecos River style rock art panel, which I think is suggestive of feasting and aggregations potentially associated with Strat 525 and Strat 385. And so if we're thinking about feasting aggregations, it's important to reiterate then that right at our Eagle Cave analysis ends just before the beginning of Pecos River style and red linear. So perhaps we're starting to look at evidence of feasting and aggregation that's also happening at different sites across the region while there's this fluorescence of different types of pictographs and other types of things. Okay, with that, thank you all very much, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
How many years did it take to gather all of that data?
Well, we started doing this in 2020. The first field season Eagle was in 2014. So we're continuing to um, build on this, and any type of dry rock shelter, any rock shelter, any major project. And this is why it's so important to have an incredible team of collaborators.
Mhm.
And also the support of the landowners and the caretakers out there. Like none of this would be possible without them.
Yeah, that's amazing. I mean, you can see how much more can be learned when the archaeologists are talking to each other. That's amazing. Well, I am definitely assuming we have some questions. Um, I think everyone was trying to listen so carefully. We don't have any currently in the chat, apart from, wow, that was amazing. Agreed. Okay, Delaney has asked a question. If they were potentially creating fermented drinks, how were they hypothetically storing liquid long enough to ferment if they didn't use pottery?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. And one of the Schumel archaeology director, Amanda Castaneda, is actually an expert in what we think is uh, how they were doing this, which could have been bedrock features. And so there's thousands of bedrock features, so depressions that are pecked into the rocks. Some of them are very small and shallow, but others are deep and much larger diameter, which could have served as places to ferment. It's also possible to ferment in things that are perishable, so things like hides or any type of like impervious organic structure, a stomach, things like that, that you could do it in. It's much more common to see it in using ceramics, though. But this is all a hypothesis. We have no evidence. We have no direct evidence for fermentation of agave or sotol beverages from the Lower Pecos. Once you get further west into the Jornada Mogollon and the Mimbres, and you have the ceramic record, then you really start to see that direct evidence of fermentation.
I was at a lecture on Saturday about cuisine and subsistence versus cuisine in Oaxaca, ancient populations. And she was an ethnobotanist, a paleoethnobotanist, talking. One of the things she mentioned is that it's really, really hard to find evidence of fermentation because of what it does to the remains. Very interesting. Marx has a question. First of all, Joan said, wonderful study and demonstrates the value of integrating multidisciplinary studies. Absolutely, it does. Marx would like to know what is the most recent fire pit you found?
So yeah, the most recent one that we sampled is between 400 and 500 years ago, and that's an Eagle Cave. The one of the unfortunate things about Eagle is that during the early 1900s and with the EB sales and J. Charles Kelly, a lot of the uppermost deposits were kind of scooped out. And so we don't have that really good record of how this site may have been used in the, archaeology. It's just the pre-colonial and the colonial like period when you would have had a lot of different groups coming through the region and undoubtedly using this area of the landscape.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have another question. This may be outside of your specialization, but does all human use of agave over the millennia result in selective pressure on the agave species themselves?
That is a great question, and one of the questions that we're really interested in exploring with Eagle Cave and other sites in the Lower Pecos. So I'll say first off, we know that in Arizona there's at least six identified cultivars, agave cultivars that were cultivated and grown by Hohokam and the ancestors of the Totonaw Odom peoples in the Phoenix and Tucson Basin. So we know that that was a thing that was happening, especially related to agricultural communities living on like the Gila River and places like that. We don't know what that looks like when you get to hunting and gathering and foraging context, when you kind of lose some of the field architectural features. But this is something we're looking at because a lot of agaves hybridize. Well, biologists look at agave hybridization as being a natural process where it's just so happens you have a lechuguilla growing next to a agave neoamericana and then they bloom at the proper time and nature happens and you have hybrids that are created. But the archaeologists and especially you know and native peoples would say, well, we can also do that. So I think that's a really important question and
Mhm.
undoubtedly like selected for taste, selected for fiber production. All these things I think are really interesting avenues to consider and look at, and really important as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Another question from Diane. She worked in Hell's Canyon on a Nez Perce longhouse site that had many FCR samples in the late 80s on a bison processing site in Montana and asks, has the technology for analyzing the rock samples been developed from the FCR samples for identifying food use? I assume this from your data were there laboratory processing flaws that lost this info. Diane, you may have to go off. Maybe Charles understands.
Well, I think, I can kind of jump in. And so the answer is like there's been some incredible analytical methods developed for looking at burned rock and trying to understand what was being cooked with those in the with the lack of macrobotanical remains or faunal remains and things like that. I am not an ex, so it's like lipid residue analysis, starch grain analysis, and
Mm,
protein
I
analysis on
understand.
the rocks themselves. And so that's certainly something that we're working towards as well for Eagle Cave. And as one of those really common things, especially when you have open air settings, that you can learn about the foods that were cooked without the material and remains that are left.
Awesome. My apologies, Diane, for reading your question poorly because I got a little lost and wasn't fully understanding, but Charles clearly did. So hopefully he answered your question. Another one from Karen, our own Shumla person. Amazing work and research. We know that the surviving wall at Eagle, Karen knows this. The surviving wall at Eagle Cave is about 5,900 radiocarbon years before present at its age, but the art is 3,280, at least the surviving art on the downstream end of the shelter. She's wondering if there might have been art that didn't survive and wondered if there was any evidence of spalls with pigment in any of the excavations.
So yeah, we did not find any spalls with painting on the wall. We also did not do much excavation along the back wall where naturally those things would fall down to. But one of the cool things, and especially as Charles Frederick and the geoarchaeology team continue to do their analysis, is we're probably going to be able to match the sediment analysis and like the limestone ball component of the matrix in the site and see stratigraphically where that kind of aligns with the stabilization and the oxalate formation that Karen's talking about that begins on the
Yeah,
rock shelter wall. Um, and
cool.
yeah.
All right, we have two more questions. I think we have time. Um, is there any sign of a population in this area prior to the culture that you're studying? What happened to the people after the entry of Europeans into the area? And do we have a last date for the use of earth ovens, I think, and associated techniques?
Yeah, so the first, the earliest archaeological evidence that we've found in the Lower Pecos of indigenous people being there is that, Clovis age, place 13,000-year-old mammoth and eagle. But you go up the Rio Grande to the Tularosa Basin and the White Sands Mitchell Range, and you have footprints and trackways of people hunting or following sloths and Columbian mammoths and things like that that are 20,000 years old. So as far as like where people were in the preceding 10,000 years, we don't have the data to answer that, but certainly it's very, very likely that native peoples were making their way through the Lower Pecos potentially for 10,000 years before we have that evidence in Eagle. Um, the after so this area especially we know that a multitude of native peoples during the time of European colonization were into and out of this region along the Pecos and the Rio Grande. So folks like the Coatecans, folks like the Humanos, the Lipan Apaches, the Mescalero Apaches, and Comanches, all these different groups were coming into and out of this area. And uh, that is, and so getting to the second part or the third part of that, the last date for the use is that people are still using it today. So we can look
Hmm.
at the Mescalero on the Mescalero Reservation, but you can also look to Coatecans and native peoples of South Texas and barbacoa. Barbacoa is the same technology. It's still building a pit, getting that heating element, whether it's charcoal or rock, and you're cooking food, cow's heads in this case, or goat. And so the technology lives on. And that's one of the really cool things about this is it draws this really, really long, deep history of cuisine and cooking methods all the way up to contemporary Tejano and Texas culture. Tejano,
Amazing
Texas
answer.
culture, indigenous Hispanic culture, all these things
All of
in
the,
that
yeah,
together.
interdisciplinary. Um, Charles, do you have a hard stop or can you answer two more questions?
I can answer a couple more questions.
Okay, great. We have two more for you and understand if people need to jump off, but we'll just continue for a few more minutes. Dennis asked through the 13,000 years. What was the range of number of people living in the canyon at a given time?
I don't have a good answer to this question. We sus Most likely there were never people living in Eagle Nest Canyon all the time. It was one of these places where people were kind of migrating or moving into or moving out of, depending on how they're just generally moving around the landscape. Um, so I don't have, yeah, I don't have a good answer to that question.
Yet. See future Lunch and Learn. And finally, Bob Preston asks, how does the use of earth ovens at Eagle Cave compare to that at sites throughout the Southwest through prehistory?
Yeah, another really great question. And I think a short answer to this is there's a lot of similarities in the general chronology. And so Miles Miller and Nancy Kenmatsu, who've specialized especially in West Texas and the Jornada Mogollon, have done a lot of pulling together radiocarbon dates, especially in far West Texas and Southeast New Mexico, and you see a lot of the same general trends. Um, and as you go, so earth ovens have been a focus in Texas, especially. As you go further west into Arizona and into the southwest New Mexico and all the way over to California, earth ovens are still there. We don't necessarily have the same chronology because of the emphasis on things like architecture and farming and stuff, as opposed to looking at roasting pits and agave baking going back 10,000 years. So it's kind of a punt, I would say. There is I'll do a self plug. So my colleague Miles Miller and I co-edited a volume that was published a couple years ago called Earth Ovens and Desert Lifeways. And so it's kind of takes a series of case studies from Texas to California, and then one contemporary study from San Luis Potosí in Mexico, looking at earth oven use and trying to get at that question, like we always focus on what's happening in Texas, but what's happening at these other areas across the Southwest, and that's a really great resource to go learn about that.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Charles. We are so happy that you were able to join us on this Monday. I know it's an unusual day for us. But yes, thank you very much for being with us. And for all of you, thank you so much for joining us. This is our final Lunch and Learn of 2025. We're building a wonderful roster for 26. And we are working on our campaign to raise $125,000 to support Shumla and programs like this one. We've raised $77,000 so far. Your gift will be matched. So if you would like to donate, please go to our website, shimla.org/donate, and support programs like these. We are so happy to have Charles here, and thank you so much. We will see you next time. And goodbye.